In the heart of Beverly Hills, behind the tall gates of a mansion built on power and wealth, a secret was unfolding that no one expected. An 8-year-old boy, once full of life, now sat silent and broken in a wheelchair, his world reduced to shadows of what it used to be. For 2 years, he hadn't taken a single step, his laughter stolen by tragedy. But on one ordinary morning, something extraordinary happened. A man in a faded uniform, a garbage collector most would never notice, walked through those gates. With nothing but music in his heart and a quiet strength in his soul, he did what doctors and money could not. He gave the boy hope. Yet what followed was not gratitude, but fury, prejudice, and a revelation that would shake an empire. The question is, why was the truth so dangerous? The Hensley estate in Beverly Hills was a monument to power. Its marble pillars reached toward the sky, and its gardens, trimmed to perfection, whispered of wealth that had been carefully guarded for generations. Inside this mansion lived Margaret Hensley, the 60-year-old matriarch who had inherited her late husband's vast telecom empire. To the world, she was a philanthropist, a woman of stature, someone who appeared to dedicate her life to helping others. But behind those polished gates, her iron grip extended to every corner of her family's existence. Her grandson, Ethan, was the soul of that household. At just 8 years old, his smile had once been the heartbeat of the family. A burst of laughter echoing through the corridors. A boy who loved to run barefoot across the sprawling lawns. That joy had vanished 2 years earlier. A sudden accident had left him confined to a wheelchair. Since that day, Ethan's world had grown smaller, his voice quieter, and his spirit dimmer. Therapists came and went, specialists whispered about new treatments, but none of them could reach the child's broken heart. Margaret's wealth could buy anything, except the one thing Ethan needed most: hope. And though she masked her frustration with stern composure, she carried her disappointment like a shadow. To her, weakness was unacceptable, even in a boy too young to understand why life had been so cruel. She controlled everything. The doctors he saw, the schedule he followed, even the photographs displayed around him. Ethan's late mother, whose memory once brought him comfort, had been erased from sight. What remained was a sterile routine and a child sinking deeper into silence. And then came Daniel Carter. To most, he was invisible. Another man in a city uniform, riding the back of a garbage truck, lifting bins under the hot California sun. He was 35, strong, quiet, and respectful. Neighbors hardly noticed him, and those who did rarely looked beyond the gloves and the faded uniform. But Daniel was not what he appeared to be. Years earlier, he had walked the halls of the University of Southern California, earning a degree in physical therapy. He had built his own clinic, a space where children learned to move again, where families found light in their darkest hours. Until one scandal destroyed it all. It was a fraud case that had nothing to do with him, yet his name was dragged into the storm. False accusations, legal battles he could not afford, and suddenly, the man who once healed children with music and movement was stripped of his career. With no money and no way to clear his reputation, Daniel was forced into the only work left available: manual labor. Each morning, he put on the city uniform, but he never let go of the knowledge, the calling, that had once defined him. Fate has a way of weaving lives together. On a morning like any other, Daniel found himself inside the grounds of the Hensley mansion, emptying bins while the world around him barely took notice. That was when he saw Ethan, sitting alone on the patio, his small hands resting lifelessly on the arms of his wheelchair. Something stirred in Daniel. He recognized that look, the heavy stillness of a child who had stopped believing. He didn't approach with grand promises. He didn't speak of cures or miracles. Instead, he knelt beside the boy, reached for his hand, and began to move gently to a rhythm only he seemed to hear. It was not medicine in the traditional sense. It was dance, slow and careful, an invitation for Ethan to feel again, to remember joy. At first, Ethan resisted, his gaze distant, his body stiff. But slowly, the corners of his mouth began to lift. His eyes flickered with something long forgotten, and for the first time in 2 years, laughter returned. It should have been a moment of light, a small victory in the shadow of sorrow. But in that house, ruled by pride and image, such a moment was not celebrated. From the balcony above, Margaret Hensley watched in silence. To her, this was not healing, it was humiliation. A garbage man, touching her grandson, doing what wealth and medical experts had failed to achieve? It was unthinkable. Her anger burned hotter than the California sun. She would not allow it. With a voice sharp enough to cut through stone, she ordered security to remove Daniel at once. Ethan's brief joy was shattered in seconds as the man who had given him hope was forced to leave. Margaret's warning was final. The garbage collector was never to return. What Margaret could not see, what she refused to understand, was that she had just set into motion a chain of events that would unravel everything she had built. For behind Daniel's quiet strength lay truths far greater than she imagined, and behind her polished image hid secrets darker than she dared admit. The stage was set for a confrontation between power and dignity, between prejudice and compassion. And at the center of it all was a boy who just wanted to walk again. Daniel's quiet departure from the mansion should have been the end of it. Most men in his position would have swallowed the insult, accepted the cruelty of the wealthy, and returned to their labor unnoticed. But fate was not finished weaving his story into Ethan's life. The next morning, Margaret Hensley acted swiftly. Her pride had been wounded, and in her world, reputation mattered more than compassion. She picked up the phone and dialed Richard Cole, the supervisor at the city's waste department. With her commanding tone, she described Daniel as unprofessional, a distraction, someone unfit to work in her neighborhood. Richard hesitated. He knew Daniel as one of the most reliable workers he had. Yet against Margaret's influence, his hesitation didn't matter. Within hours, Daniel was reassigned. No more quiet routes through polished streets and mansion-lined blocks. Instead, he was sent to an industrial zone where the stench of rotting waste clung to the air and the work was twice as brutal. Daniel did not argue. He accepted the new assignment, just as he had accepted every setback since his fall from grace. But behind his calm silence, pain lingered. He had not only lost a chance to help a child, he had been reminded once again that in the eyes of the powerful, his worth was defined only by the dirt under his nails. Ethan, however, had not forgotten. That night, the boy refused to eat. He sat in his room, staring at the spot where Daniel once knelt beside him, replaying the laughter he thought he'd lost forever. For the first time in years, he had felt alive. And now that light had been stolen. Days turned into weeks. Daniel carried on, rising before dawn, enduring the grueling industrial route. Yet destiny has a way of bending even the most carefully controlled plans. One afternoon, his phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Kim, a physician at a rehabilitation center. She had once crossed paths with Daniel years earlier when his clinic was still alive, and she remembered his unique approach. A child had fallen into despair, refusing therapy, retreating from the world. She asked if Daniel could help, just for a few sessions. When Daniel walked into the center, he froze. There, sitting in the therapy room, was Ethan. The boy's face, pale from isolation, lit up the instant he recognized him. His small hands trembled with excitement, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hope returned to him like air to drowning lungs. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. Against every warning Margaret had given, he could not turn away. He stepped forward, took Ethan's hand again, and began the same gentle rhythm that had once sparked laughter. And just like before, Ethan responded. His body loosened, his spirit lifted, and the room filled with the sound of joy that had been missing for so long. What Margaret didn't know was that the very man she had banished was now becoming the lifeline her grandson desperately needed. For 2 weeks, Daniel worked quietly with Ethan. Day by day, the boy grew stronger. His muscles remembered movement, his spirit remembered freedom, and his laughter filled the halls of the center. Staff members watched in awe, whispering about the garbage man who achieved what specialists could not. But progress often threatens power. And as Daniel drew closer to Ethan, he began to notice shadows lurking beneath Margaret's carefully polished image. At first, it was small details. The way Ethan was forbidden to speak about his mother, the strict schedules that left him no space for joy, the sharp glances from staff whenever Margaret's name was mentioned. Something was wrong. Daniel's instincts, honed from years of listening to families in pain, told him this was deeper than grief. One evening, unable to ignore the questions burning in his mind, he began to investigate Margaret's highly praised charity, the New Horizons Foundation. Public records were open to anyone willing to look, and what he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 5 years, the foundation has collected more than $4 million in donations. Yet less than 10% of that money ever reached children's programs. The rest disappeared into consultancy fees, administrative costs, and payments to shell companies. A pattern emerged: companies tied to Margaret's distant relatives, billing the foundation for equipment and services that never existed. The most damning evidence came in the form of a $600,000 purchase of rehabilitation equipment. When Daniel traced the supplier, it wasn't a medical firm at all. It was a small storefront registered under Margaret's cousin. The equipment had been resold to private clinics, and the profit funneled straight into Margaret's accounts. Daniel's hands shook as he copied the documents, each file another nail in the coffin of Margaret's empire. He realized what made her so desperate to control Ethan's life. It wasn't just about protecting her grandson, it was about protecting herself. A joyful, recovering child might ask questions, might notice things, might expose truths Margaret had buried. Keeping him isolated was not just cruelty, it was a strategy. The more Daniel uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Margaret's philanthropy was a mask, her power a fortress built on lies. And now, by helping Ethan, Daniel stood in direct opposition to everything she had worked to hide. Still, he pressed on. Each session with Ethan was a small act of rebellion, each smile a victory against the chains of silence. But he knew it couldn't last forever. Margaret's influence reached everywhere. It was only a matter of time before she discovered that the man she had cast out was the very one pulling her carefully guarded world apart. And when that day came, the collision between truth and power would be explosive. The day of reckoning arrived not with warning, but with a storm of fury. Margaret Hensley swept into the rehabilitation center like a queen marching into enemy territory. Her diamond earrings glittered under the fluorescent lights, her tailored suit crisp, her expression carved from ice. For weeks, whispers had reached her, rumors of her grandson laughing again, of progress she had never authorized, of a man she had forbidden returning to his side. And now, standing at the entrance of the therapy room, she saw it with her own eyes. There was Ethan, smiling as Daniel guided him through careful, measured steps. His arms trembled, his legs shook, but his spirit burned brighter than it had in years. Each movement was fragile, miraculous, and precious. For a brief moment, the room was filled with something sacred. Hope. Then Margaret's voice split the air. It was sharp, cold, dripping with disdain. She lashed out, her words tearing at Daniel's dignity, calling him a fraud, a pretender, a man unworthy to touch her grandson. Staff froze in silence, unsure whether to intervene. Ethan's face collapsed into fear, his progress shattered by the venom of his grandmother's rage. Daniel stood motionless, absorbing each insult like stones hurled at his chest. For years, he had borne the weight of lies, the shame of a ruined reputation, the stares of strangers who believed the worst. But this moment was different. This was no longer just about him. It was about Ethan, the boy clinging to hope, and the truth Margaret had buried under wealth and power. Dr. Patricia Kim stepped forward, her voice steady but firm, defending Daniel's work. She pointed to Ethan's progress, undeniable proof that something extraordinary was happening. But Margaret dismissed her, insisting that money, not compassion, dictated the terms of healing. The tension cracked when Ethan, with trembling breath, whispered for the first time in months. His plea was simple: he wanted Daniel to stay. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the boy who had found his voice again. And in that silence, Margaret's control began to fracture. Daniel reached into his bag. With calm precision, he pulled out a thick folder, the product of long nights spent piecing together the puzzle of deceit. He laid it on the table before them, his hands steady though his heart thundered in his chest. One by one, he spread the documents across the surface. Bank transfers, invoices, fraudulent contracts, the evidence of millions siphoned away from children in need. Jonathan Hensley, Ethan's father, had been summoned quietly by Dr. Kim. He entered the room at that very moment, his eyes scanning the papers with growing fury. Each page was a dagger to his heart, revealing not just financial betrayal but the cruelty inflicted upon his son in the name of control. Jonathan's face turned pale, then red with anger. He looked at his mother, the woman he had trusted, and saw not strength but corruption. His voice trembled as he demanded an explanation, but Margaret could offer none. The mask of the philanthropist had cracked, and beneath it lay the raw greed of a woman who had built an empire on lies. Margaret tried to deny it, her voice shrill, her excuses desperate. But the truth was undeniable. The room, once hers to command, now turned against her. Staff who had once bowed to her power stood in silent judgment. Dr. Kim crossed her arms, her eyes unwavering. And Ethan looked at her not with fear, but with disappointment. For Margaret, this was the true humiliation. Not the exposure of fraud, not the anger of her son, but the gaze of her grandson, who saw her clearly for the first time. The air grew heavy as Jonathan made his choice. He declared, with fire in his voice, that Margaret would no longer control Ethan's life. He demanded that she return the stolen money, that she step down, that she leave his family forever. Each word was a hammer blow, breaking the chains Margaret had so carefully forged. Daniel, standing quietly at Ethan's side, felt the weight of vindication. Years of silence, years of carrying the shame of accusations, and now, finally, the truth stood in the open. Yet he knew this was not the end. What lay ahead was larger than this room, larger than this family. Because in Daniel's hand was not just evidence for Jonathan. Copies of those same documents had already been sent beyond these walls, to the FBI, to journalists, to people who could ensure justice reached further than Margaret's reach ever had. As Margaret collapsed into her chair, her empire crumbling around her, Daniel lifted Ethan gently from his wheelchair. The boy's steps were shaky, uncertain, but they were steps nonetheless. And with each one, Margaret's power dissolved, replaced by something she could never buy or control. The strength of truth, the resilience of dignity, and the unstoppable will of a child learning to stand again. But the fight was not over. Outside those walls, lawyers, agents, and reporters were circling. The empire Margaret had built on deception was about to collapse in public view. And Daniel, once dismissed as nothing more than a garbage man, was about to stand at the center of a storm that would decide not only Ethan's future, but his own redemption. The question remained: when the dust settled, would justice truly be served? 6 months later, the mansion on the hill no longer carried the same power it once did. Margaret Hensley's name, once synonymous with philanthropy and prestige, now appeared in headlines alongside words like fraud, embezzlement, and indictment. The New Horizons Foundation had collapsed under the weight of federal investigations. Lawsuits piled high, assets froze, and the empire she had built on manipulation and greed was crumbling into dust. For Margaret, the price of prejudice was more than legal consequences. It was isolation. The very society she had sought to impress turned its back, leaving her alone with the bitter truth that her power had never been unshakable. The boy she had tried to control no longer looked to her for approval. The community she had deceived no longer bowed in respect. Her wealth, her titles, her influence, all became meaningless against the weight of truth. Ethan's world, however, had changed in ways no court ruling could measure. At the rehabilitation center and now at a new clinic in Beverly Hills, his days were filled not with silence but with music, laughter, and the slow rhythm of recovery. Each step he took was a victory, each dance a reminder that hope could bloom even in the darkest soil. His legs were still weak, but his spirit was strong, and for the first time in years, he believed in a future brighter than his past. And at his side was Daniel Carter, the man who had once been invisible, the garbage collector dismissed by society, insulted by the powerful, cast aside as less than human, now stood as a healer, a mentor, and a symbol of resilience. With the settlement money returned and donations redirected, Daniel opened his own clinic, dedicated to providing free rehabilitation for children who, like Ethan, had been told their lives were limited. Families came from across the city, bringing children who had lost hope and left with something priceless: dignity and possibility. Jonathan, humbled by the revelation of his mother's betrayal, became one of Daniel's greatest supporters. More importantly, he became present in Ethan's life in a way he never had before. Together, father and son rebuilt what Margaret's control had stolen from them: trust, freedom, and love. But this story was never just about one family. It was about what happens when prejudice is allowed to dictate power, when wealth is used to silence the voices of those deemed lesser. Daniel's journey revealed a painful truth that echoes far beyond Beverly Hills: that too often, society judges a man by the dirt on his hands rather than the strength of his character. That racism and classism, dressed up in respectability, still rot the foundations of communities. How many Daniels walk among us today? Men and women with talents unrecognized, with hearts full of compassion, forced into invisibility because of the color of their skin or the uniform they wear. How many children like Ethan remain trapped, not just by disability, but by the prejudices of those who should protect them? This story reminds us that true strength is not measured in bank accounts, mansions, or the number of people one can command. It is measured in the courage to stand when standing is hardest, to fight for dignity when the world insists on your silence, and to give hope where none remains. Margaret's empire fell, but the lesson her downfall left behind remains standing. Prejudice may build walls, but truth has the power to tear them down. Daniel's resilience proved that no amount of power can erase integrity, and no amount of wealth can buy compassion. As Ethan laughed and danced in the clinic, surrounded by children who had once believed they were forgotten, the message was clear: racism, prejudice, and greed can break bones, break trust, even break families, but they cannot break the human spirit when it refuses to bend. And now the question turns to us. When we see injustice, will we stay silent like the staff who once obeyed Margaret's command, or will we stand like Daniel, who chose to fight back with dignity? Because in the end, stories like these are not just about the past. They are about the choices we make today. Choices that decide whether we live in a world ruled by prejudice or one healed by compassion. So ask yourself, in the face of injustice, who will you be? What do you think about Daniel's journey? A man dismissed as nothing more than a garbage collector ended up exposing corruption, healing a broken boy, and proving that true strength comes from character, not wealth. If you were in his place, would you have had the courage to keep fighting, even when the odds were stacked against you? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more powerful stories every day.